we're going to talk about consideration. Well, in particular, the focus for the rest of today will be on the nature and the requirement for consideration. Next week, in topic 6, we will start unpacking the adequacy, how we find sufficient consideration and that difference between adequate and sufficient. So, consideration is one of the preconditions for the creation of a legally enforceable agreement. We're going to examine the rules on what constitutes valid consideration, and when we move into next week, we'll start to look at some of the exceptions to that rule, those rules as well. So, pretty quick today, broken slide, but that's okay. The authors of your textbook say the following: the doctrine of consideration requires that something must be given in return for a promise in order to make it, here it is the promise, binding. To be quite, even though we're going to spend a week and a half on it, consideration is usually just taken for granted. The only time that the courts really need to consider whether or not there was consideration is if a party to a decision is arguing that there was no consideration, therefore no contract, because they don't want to fulfill whatever obligation it is that the other party thinks that they should fulfill on the whole. The nature of a contract, when we think about it, it involves that exchange. Even just buying a cup of coffee, there is a swap, cash for coffee, cash for toilet paper rolls, whatever it happens to be. The exchange can be not only of things though, like it could be an exchange of, you don't have to have money involved, exchange of the pointer for the textbook. But what's really important for us to understand, particularly in a bilateral contract, which the vast majority of contracts we deal with would be classified as bilateral contracts, is it can be exchange of promises. So the price of the promise is the language we hear quite often. So I promise to pay you $10 and you promise to mow my lawn. You have promised to pay to mow my lawn, and the price for that promise that I pay is my promise to pay you $10. And I have promised you to pay you $10, and the price for the promise that you pay is the promise to mow my lawn. Now often these things happen instantaneously and it doesn't matter, but it is really important to understand that idea that consideration is most often an exchange of promises, and it moves from both sides. So, how about you have a go now? Again in, I'll just get rid of the slide in a second. Again in Poll Everywhere. Let's see if we can come up with some definitions of promises that, everything is too hard for me today. Just moving it around. So, in the immortal words of the lawyer in Philadelphia, how would you explain consideration? I'll just clear some old responses, unless you've already just been doing them now, but I don't think so. Let's ignore that and activate. Here we go. So what I would like for you to do is just go full screen. There, what I would like you to do is have a go at defining what consideration is. That is really annoying that the number of people who have participated is sitting under those little pointers, because I've got no idea whether or not you're doing it. But have a go. Let's see if there's anything in there. Consideration is money. Consideration is price. So the price for a promise is clearly, it's a technical definition that works, but is it a meaningful definition to somebody who is not a lawyer? If you're a good girl, I'll give you chocolate. So, in other words, you're explaining what it is that you will give in exchange. Exchange of equal value between two or more people. Give me your ice cream and I'll give you a car. I love ice cream too, but I'm thinking an ice cream for a car, not equal value, but also it doesn't have to be equal value. It needs to be of sufficient value. It needs to be legally sufficient. Cafes promises to sell you a coffee and your consideration is paying for that coffee, or more likely, promising to pay for that coffee. Especially if you're sitting down in the cafe, you usually pay when you leave. There is a promise to pay effectively on leaving. Something you give or promise to someone else in exchange for what they are giving or promising you. I love that definition. That I think makes sense to people who haven't got legal training. Well done. The thing that one person needs from another for a promise. It's a good definition there. I would, rather than need, use something like agrees to in exchange for making their promise binding. Something of value? The title of the opening track from Rihanna's 2016 studio album. I don't know who you are, but I love you too. And yes, what I give you to ensure you have something to give me back. So it is effectively the thing that you promise in order to ensure that the thing that has been promised to you is binding. Excellent. Excellent. I will share all of these as they come through. Any questions, concerns, frustrations here? Any observations that any of you would like to make? Let me proceed back to my slide pack then, but feel free to share those things as they come up. I really hope none of you really have that face. So consideration goes way back to the 16th century. The legal effect of a promise depended on the considerations or the factors that motivated the making of that promise. This idea of consideration is closely aligned to this idea that if a promise is to be binding, that there must be some sort of exchange or moral reason for it. Promises came to be enforceable when the promisee, so the person who wants to enforce the benefit of a promise, had conferred some benefit on the promisor, or the promisee had acted to their detriment in reliance on the promise. But that wasn't where it ended. So this kind of mud map, we're going to keep coming back to this flowchart that I've put together that is really a method for thinking about whether or not there is sufficient consideration. Now it looks very messy, but we're going to just do it bit by bit. So the first question we need to ask ourselves is there legally sufficient consideration? So rather than asking, is there consideration, the question needs to be, is it a legally sufficient consideration or not? And this is because the purpose of the consideration is to work out whether or not a court is going to enforce the promise. And it will not enforce a promise unless consideration has been given for it. Unless. So consideration will not be required for deeds or where there is a promissory estoppel. Now, I don't want you to worry too much about promissory estoppel. It's a type of remedy. It is not a way of setting up a contract. It is a particular set of circumstances in equity where a court will enforce a particular type of promise, effectively an exception to the requirement for consideration, where there has been an unjust reliance. So it requires some inequity. But the most important of these is where there is a deed. So if you have a deed you don't have to worry about the consideration question. Now, there might be some other reasons why you need to be concerned about it, but you will need to, because, and when you get to equity, you'll understand those reasons a little bit better, but work on the basis at the moment. If there is a deed, then you don't need to make a promise. I've got a couple of questions here, and I've seen a raised hand somewhere. I've got to deal with that. So the question I have is, can you maybe just focus a bit more on explaining the side of which we are approaching the subject matter? Is the approach coming from the promisor's side or the promisee? Excellent question. Really great question. Bear with me because this is a little bit confusing, but when you think about it, one of the reasons why we stop using offeror and offeree is because at the stage when we make a contract, we have an exchange of promises. Now, this gets a little bit circular when you think about this, but in order for there to be a contract, we need to have consideration, which means the price for the promise will be another promise. So if I'm thinking about it from the point of view of buying a cup of coffee, so if I am the purchaser, I make a promise to pay for all of the things I order off the menu. And in exchange for a promise that the food will be brought to my table and the coffee will come. So from my point of view, the price for my promise to pay is the food, the promise to bring me food and coffee. From the cafe's point of view, the price for the promise to bring food and beverages is the promise to pay money. Now, I know it gets really circular, but we'll keep coming back to it and it will start to make sense shortly.